thank you for coming here on the winter solstice, the 21st of June 2023, the coldest day of the year. A great day to have a pot or a pint. So, today we're going to talk about, well, I'm going to talk about, and you can obviously questions and answers later on. No, this is serious. We're going to do the Eureka Rebellion and its relevance to Australia in 2023. So it is going to be a bit long-winded because this is one of my favourite subjects. I was once quoted as being a foremost expert on the Eureka Rebellion, which I thought was very nice. But what's the Eureka? What we need to do is we need to actually look at the whole thing from the beginning, because if we don't look at the whole thing from the beginning, we'll have no idea of how it developed and why it developed and its significance. Now, I'd just like to remind you that since 2002, the Anarchist Media Institute has been doing the Reclaim the Radical Spirit of the Eureka Rebellion celebrations at Ballarat, and it's a 16-hour extravaganza. We continued during COVID, but in a more truncated form. But this year, on the 3rd of December, we'll be there again. We start at 4 a.m. We've now got a close relationship with Ballarat Trades Hall, which is part of the Reclaim the Radical Spirit of the Eureka Rebellion celebration group, and goes from 4 a.m. to 10 p.m. We're going to have dinner this year. I'd also like to remind people that we've opened up nominations for the Eureka Australia Medal. I'm sure you all pored over the King's Birthdays honours list to see if anybody you knew was there, and obviously nobody you knew would have been there. And the Eureka Australia Medal was started in 2005 to actually acknowledge activists around the country who've devoted many years of their lives to improving the situation for ordinary people. So those nominations are now open. They need to be in writing. You can email to them info@anarchistmedia.org, or you can post them to Post Office Box 20, Parkville 3052. Also, I'm trying to get people to pre-book, doesn't cost anything, to pre-book for the dinner, because once we've got a specific number, then I can actually book a particular hotel for the Eureka dinner on the 3rd of December. So what's that got to do with Eureka? Well, the first thing is you've got to remember is you've got to understand the history of Victoria. Now, Victoria was an illegal colony, even in the eyes of the British Empire, not just the traditional inhabitants, but the actual British Empire. Because what happened is that ticket of leave men and women from Tasmania came across to Victoria, to where Melbourne is, led by Mr. Batman, on a ship called the Free Enterprise. Remember that, the Free Enterprise. And they came here because a few years earlier there'd been a Major Mitchell crossed from Sydney across Victoria, and what he noted was that this was excellent grazing land for sheep. And the reason it was excellent grazing land for sheep was the Aboriginal land management practices, which basically spelt their demise. Now, the Henty brothers set up in Portland just before Batman came to Melbourne. Now, when Batman got to Melbourne, he entered into an agreement with the Waffarong, which are part of the Kulin Nation. But the thing is, you've got to remember is that there's been a lot of interaction between local Aboriginal people and Europeans since the beginning of the 19th century. There were sealers on the coast of Victoria who used it as a base, for their sealing operations. So what's that got to do with Eureka? Well, what happened is that the land was rapidly squatted. And when we talk about squatters in the 19th century, we're not talking about homeless people looking for a house, a roof over their heads, squatting an empty house. The squatters, in a period of 15 years, dispossessed and killed most of the local Aboriginal population, which had been reduced from about 100,000 to 20,000 before European colonisation because of disease, and then down to about 2,000 within 15 years by about 1850. So, and the reason is they wanted the land for sheep. And why did they want the land for sheep? The Industrial Revolution in Europe and in Britain required wool. And wool is a wonderful thing to transport. You don't need to refrigerate it. You don't need to do anything special. Just put it in bales and send it off. Now, the squatters, by 1850, there were about 702 squatters that squatted every centimetre of Victorians' land. And most of the Aboriginal people, the remnants, were pushed into very marginal situations. Now, the squatters relied on ticket of leave men and women. Ticket of leave men and women were convicts who had done their sentence, and then they had to spend another 7 or 14 years in the country before they could return to Britain, and they were basically a source of very, very cheap labour. This was brutalised cheap labour which they could use to conduct their extermination program and also obviously raise sheep. This is what it was all about, sheep. So in 1851, Victoria broke away from New South Wales. Under the British Colonies Act, it was declared to be an independent colony. And Governor Latrobe, who had been the Governor of Victoria since his exception, initially Superintendent and then Governor of Victoria, what happened is Governor Latrobe was replaced by Governor Hotham. Now in 1851, gold was actually discovered just outside Melbourne in the Dandenong Ranges, but it was kept hush-hush for one very good reason, because the squatters, who now dominated the Legislative Council, which had been established when Victoria was declared independent in 1851 from New South Wales, required cheap labour. You think of, now the thing is, if you've got this cheap labour and all of a sudden the hue and cry goes out, there's gold to be discovered in them hills, they're going to run away. It's a little bit like buying a ticket for your $100 million Powerball on Thursday night. Now obviously there'll be one or two people who will win, but gold prospecting, even alluvial gold prospecting, those of you who have done it, is a little bit like a lot of people lose, so a few win big. It's like Tats Lotto. A lot of lose, a few win big. So when gold was rediscovered in 1853-54, the population of Victoria was about, the European population of Victoria was about 50,000, okay? The Legislative Council realised they couldn't keep hiding the gold discoveries because gold was being discovered all over central Victoria. You know, alluvial gold. Alluvial gold is very easy. You just need a pan, you go down to a creek and you shift through the dirt and wait for the yellow bits to arrive. So they made a very important decision which led to the Eureka Rebellion. This is what people won't tell you. They made the decision to tax the miner, not tax the gold that the miner extracted from the earth. And the thing is, if we tax the miner, then they won't leave our employment to go gold digging because it'll be too expensive for them. And they were charging £5 for a month's licence to dig gold in a 5 metre by 5 metre square. So every single miner, irrespective of whether they found gold or not, was charged, except there were some exceptions. Female miners were not charged, doctors weren't charged, and small shopkeepers weren't charged because they needed shopkeepers to supply things. So this is the very important piece of legislation. The miners were the ones who were taxed to mine the gold, not the gold was not taxed. And this was a decision of the Legislative Council, which was dominated by the squatters in order to maintain their cheap labour source, which is basically ticket of leave men and women. Now, when the gold rushes began, you've got to remember, this is an international movement. You had the gold rushes in California in 1849. And then when that gold petered out, then people came to Australia. So within 12 months, a population of 50,000 swelled to 250,000. Think of that. 50,000, 12 months, 250,000 people came here looking for gold. Now, unfortunately for the authorities, many of the people that came looking for gold in the 1850s were radicals, people who'd been radicalised in the struggles which were occurring in Europe. The failed wave of revolutions in 1848 across Europe led to a lot of political refugees making their way here. There was the Irish rebellions. Many of the Irish rebels made their way to Australia. There were the Chartists, which was an English movement for universal male suffrage in England, which, not universal male suffrage, just suffrage, okay? Don't get excited there, colleague. But universal male suffrage. And many of them flocked to the goldfields because it was like buying a Tats Lotto ticket. So the people who came here looking for a new life. Like most migrants who come here today. They're looking for a new life free of the strictures, inequalities of the old world. But when they came here to mine gold, they soon found that it was a fool's game, that only a few actually made gold. But at the same time, in 1853, the Victorian police force had been formed by Governor Latrobe. 1853, the same police force we have now, its origins were in 1853. Now, the police were poorly paid. Many of them deserted and went to the goldfields. But in order to retain police, and this is another thing that caused dissension in the goldfields across Victoria, was the police were paid a portion of the fine that was levied on the diggers if they didn't have a gold licence on them while they were digging gold. Could you imagine that? You're in the mud, you're panning for gold. The coppers, they used to call them Joes because it was Joe Latrobe, that was his name, they were Joe's boys. They would arrive, I'm laughing because Colleen's taking pictures, but they would arrive looking for this piece of paper, and if you didn't have the piece of paper, you were fined £5. And you were dragged off, tied to a log outside the Camp Street, I'm talking about in Ballarat now, Camp Street in Ballarat, until you paid the £5 fine. And the police officer who arrested you will get a percentage of the fine. So obviously, you've got, it's going to cause friction in the community.
It's easy just to arrest someone, take their permit off them.
Yep.
And fine them.
That's right, because you get a percentage. That's how you augment your income, because your wages are so miserable. So you've got these things. You've got to pay a monthly miners fee. You've got to carry it around with you. If you get caught, the copper who catches you gets a percentage of the fine. So you can imagine how the relationship between the police and the miners who were looking for a new way of life was a little bit strained.
Can I ask what was £5?
It would be a week. It'd be at least 2 weeks' wages today. So it was real money, real money. So there was dissension on all the goldfields, the Bendigo goldfield, the Dalesford goldfields. There was dissension, but things came to a head on the Ballarat goldfields. Now the British authorities were quite concerned about the possibility of rebellion. So they appointed Governor Hotham, who was a rigid naval disciplinarian as Governor of Victoria in order to violently put down any talk of insurrection. Now, on the first, this is an important date, on the 11th of November 1854, remember that's an important date in Australian history, 11th of November 1854, the Ballarat Reform League was formed. The Ballarat Reform League was the organisation behind the Eureka rebellion in Ballarat. The Ballarat Reform League was formed on the 11th of November 1854, and if those of you who've got a memory for history, 11th of November 1880, Ned Kelly was hung in the Old Melbourne Jail. 11th of November 1918 was Armistice Day, the end of the war fought by workers at either end of the bayonet, and the 11th of November 1975 was the dismissal of the Whitlam Labor government. So it's an interesting day. Everybody talks about the last three. Nobody talks about the 11th of November 1854, the formation of the Ballarat Reform League. And what the Ballarat Reform League consisted of was representatives from the goldfields in Ballarat. There were approximately 30,000 people on the Ballarat goldfield in 1854. And let's forget, this was a rapidly increasing population. They didn't live in huts, they lived in tents across the goldfields. And if you live in a tent city, how do you know where the baker is? How do you know where the whorehouse is? How do you know, where the blacksmith is? A flag. You have a flag outside your tent, so you can get out of your tent and you see, oh, there's the baker. You can go there, right? That's how people knew where things were. So when the Ballarat Reform League was formed on the 11th of November 1854, they needed a symbol to unify them, a symbol which they could use to gather people at what they used to call monster meetings at Bakery Hill, and I'll speak about them later on. So what they did is, when the committee of, I think it was 13, met on the 11th of November, they were racking their brains for a symbol. And the story goes like this, and I'm sure it's not true, but it's a good story. The story goes like this. It was a it was a relatively cold night in Ballarat, which those of you who've been there for the dawn ceremony would attest to, right? And this bloke went out to relieve himself. And as he's relieving himself, he looked up in the sky and he saw the Southern Cross. And he raced back in and he said, why not the Southern Cross? Now, why the Southern Cross? Because in the Northern Hemisphere, you cannot see the Southern Cross. And you cannot see the Morning Star, which is on the flag of the West Papuan Independence Movement. They've got the Morning Star, we have the Southern Cross. So the Southern Cross was adopted as a symbol of a new life in a new land. Because when you're in a bloody tent city in the middle of the night in front of your campfire and you're looking up, you're not playing Nintendo, you're not on social media, you're not a clicked activist, you're not watching TV, you're not listening to the radio in 1854, you're basically looking at the sky and you would see the Southern Cross and that would remind you that you're in a new world. So that was adopted. So the call went out to the women of Eureka to make the flag. And those of you who've been to Ballarat, when I do the presentation at the Ballarat Eureka Centre, will be interested to know that most of the flag is made out of women's petticoats and undergarments. And it was sewn overnight, the flag. And then it was hoisted at Bakery Hill for the first monster meeting. Now, the idea of a monster meeting is exceptionally radical. A monster meeting, which they used to have in Europe and England, the Irish rebels, the Chartists, and other revolutionaries in Europe in the failed revolutions, is a pure form of democracy. It's not a representative democracy where you cast a ballot and you elect somebody for 3 to 4 years to make decisions for you. At a monster meeting, and this is monster meetings of 15,000 people, half the population of Ballarat, you know, people racing around selling lemonade and bread and cakes. No PAs. Here I am, all hooked up with a PA system. You're on top of this bloody hill at Bakery Hill, trying to project your voice over 15,000 people carrying on like a bunch of nuts, right? But it's a direct democracy in action. And what the monster meetings did is they passed resolutions and then they appointed or elected delegates to carry out those resolutions. And then the delegates had to come back to another monster meeting to tell them about their negotiations with Hotham and the colonial authorities in Melbourne. Now, obviously, the British colonists were very keen to suppress this movement, because if it broke out in Ballarat, it could break out in Bendigo, Daylesford and all the other places, Geelong and all the other places where there were gold diggers. So what happened is the actual number of police which were deployed to Ballarat was increased dramatically. There was armed confrontation, skirmishes between miners, shooting from pits, you know, police shooting back. And so the Hotham ordered the armed forces into Ballarat. On the 29th of November 1854, after the monster meeting at Ballarat, where the delegates had reported back to the meeting that all their demands had been rejected, because the Ballarat Reform League had a list of demands. You know, paid representatives, universal male suffrage, no miners' licence, just went on and on, a list of demands. Everyone was rejected. What happened is that the crowd broke up, but a more militant rump went up to Bakery Hill to affirm the Eureka Oath. Now, the Eureka Oath, remember this is 1854, encapsulates everything that's important as far as the Eureka Rebellion is concerned. When people look at the Eureka Rebellion, some think of it as a small business revolution. Others think of it as, some people just going gangbusters. Others look at the historical reenactment, but very few look at the political essence of the rebellion. And the essence of the rebellion is incorporated in the Eureka Oath, which was sworn at Bakery Hill on the 29th of November 1854 by about 500 poorly armed miners, who then went down to the Eureka Stockade, the Eureka diggings, and formed the stockade. And I'll go through the oath quickly and then go through each section, because it really highlights the essence of this rebellion. It is one of the most extraordinary oaths, one of the extraordinary string of words that's ever been put together by any human being during the course of human history. And it happened here at Ballarat in Victoria. And the oath is very simple. Peter Lalor at that particular time was the armed faction of the Ballarat Reform League, jumped on the stump, and this was the oath. We swear by the Southern Cross to stand truly by each other and fight to defend our rights and liberties. We swear by the Southern Cross to stand truly by each other and fight to defend our rights and liberties. Now I'll go through it section by section. We. They didn't say white Anglo-Saxon males with two dicks. They didn't say that. They said we. Everybody on the goldfields. And remember, people came from all corners of the earth to find their fortunes in the goldfield. Men and women. People from the United States. People from Europe. Non-English speaking people. People from the British Empire. People from India. Chinese. Not at that stage. They came a little bit later. There were a few Chinese, but not many at that stage. They came later. That's a different story. That's Laming Flat. That's another nasty story. But, right, we swear by the Southern Cross. Now, we swear by the Southern Cross. A lot of people think this is some religious Christian analogy. It's not. They swear by what they saw in the sky. This symbol of a new life. And there was no way they were going to bend and go back to the old ways because of the British forces there. There was no way they were going to go back. These were political refugees, nationalists, Republicans, Chartists, people who'd escaped, who came here to form a new life. We swear by the Southern Cross to stand truly by each other, mutual aid. They understood that as individuals there's nothing they could do. It's only by joining together that you can make change. We swear by the Southern Cross to stand truly by each other and fight to defend our rights and liberties. They believed, unlike Australians in 2023, that they were born with inalienable rights and liberties which they inherited at birth. They believed that the state couldn't take away, or the authorities could not take away these rights and liberties. It was their inalienable rights and liberties. So it's an extraordinary few words that are strung together. We swear by the Southern Cross to stand truly by each other and fight to defend our rights and liberties. And there was one word which is usually left out of the oath, amen, which means the end. That's a literal translation, the end of the oath, all right? So this is the oath. Now, there were people there of all nationalities, all races, all colours, spoke all languages. Think about it. On the goldfields, all tried to wrest a fortune from the goldfields, but they had one common oppressor, which was the Legislative Council and the miners' licence and the police, which were there to enforce that miners' licence. On the 29th of November, they walked from Bakery Hill to the Eureka gold diggings, where they set up the stockade. Now, the stockade wasn't some huge stockade. It was only about an acre in size. About an acre in size, very small. You know, we talk about a quarter-acre block. You know, the quintessential, you know, Australian backyard. 4 of them, an acre. They put a stockade, and they started to drill. They started to acquire horses and arms. Because you remember, the goldfields, it's different to today, where you need all these licenses to have weapons. Many of the miners had weapons there for their own defence. So they started to drill, and they broke up and they drilled in the stockade, where they set up a flagpole, flew up the Southern Cross and began to drill. They broke up into different fighting groups. Each group appointed their own military commander by election. Raphael Carboni became the commander of the non-English speaking battalion. Right? So there they are, marching away on the 2nd of December, you know, being brave, having their rifles, you know, talking about how great it's all going to be, they're going to win, blah, blah, blah. And that evening, they all go back to their tents. Well, they all had tents around the stockade. They went back to their tents after their thing, because the 3rd of December was a Sunday. And nobody in their right mind thought that the authorities would attack them on a Sunday. And in the stockade were 103 miners. And guess what? That evening, all this free grog arrived in the stockade. Lots of free grog just arrived in the stockade. You know, miners like Gaz there, free grog, you know, they enjoyed it. So at 2 a.m, at Camp Street, where Ballarat Trades Hall is now in Ballarat, the troops had massed. There were about 240 soldiers, most of them on horseback, and about 90 Victoria Police on horseback. And they slowly rode down, because Camp Street is on a hill. If you're in Ballarat, it's the centre of the city. It's on a hill. Rode down to where the stockade was. Now, most of the miners were a little bit inebriated. Many were asleep. There was only 103 there. There's about 350 on the other side. Eventually, when they were less than 100 metres from the stockade, people woke up, a shot rang out, and the deputy commander of the British troops, Captain Wise, was shot, fell off his horse, and he was shot by John Joseph. And who was John Joseph? He was a freed slave from New York. A free black man from New York who'd made his way to Melbourne to find his fortune, right? So his was one of the first shots that rang out. Within 15 minutes, the stockade had been overrun. But during that period, the first 5 minutes, the pikemen, and these were the bravest of the brave, these were men who had no guns, who stood in front of the flag, who had long pikes, which is an Irish tradition, and at the end of the pike you got a little sharp curve which would be made by the local blacksmith, and what the pike is used is to cut the bridle of the horse so the actual soldier can be unseated, right? So they stood there, 30 of them stood there, watching all these troops come at them on horses, stood their ground so the people behind them could escape into the tents around the stockade. And 15 of them died. 15 died during that period. Some of the bodies were riddled with musket balls, 15, 20 musket balls. But that gave the rest of the stockaders time to escape into the general population. Now, this is not the end of it. The British troops hauled down the Southern Cross and they celebrated. But the glorious Victoria Police, which were formed in 1853, decided now's the time to get our revenge. And many of the people that died, and many were not even involved in the stockade, many of the people that died were just bystanders, people in their tents, as the Victoria Police ran roughshod over the encampment for 3 hours, shooting, killing, stealing gold. And many people talk about the Eureka massacre, not the Eureka battle, because the battle was over in 15 minutes. At the same time, Governor Hotham had declared martial law, and almost every soldier and police in Victoria was deployed to Ballarat. Think about it. Think about it. They're deployed to Ballarat. Now, the authorities thought that this was the end of it. But what happened, because all the armed forces were in Ballarat under I think it was General Nicholson, what happened is all the other areas started to revolt. We had a mass meeting in the Melbourne Town Hall for about 6,000 people, because when the next day people began to understand what had happened, because see, you've got to remember, we talk about a free independent media, which is a load of garbage, but in 1854 you had 4 newspapers in Ballarat, serving a population of 30,000 people. And the newspapers had for weeks, months, supported the move to get rid of the miner's licence. So information got back to Melbourne, to Geelong, to Daylesford, everywhere, and the authorities realised that all their arms were up in Ballarat, and all that was left in Melbourne was 30 naval personnel from 2 ships which were in the harbour who were guarding the Treasury building where the gold was. Okay? So, what happened? The next day, the bodies were piled onto carts from the Eureka battleground, and those of you who've been to the old Ballarat cemetery, and you had soldiers with drawn bayonets every metre from Eureka to the old Ballarat cemetery, where a mass grave had been dug, and the half of the people that had died in the Eureka battle were buried in that mass grave. Right? No, just buried. Bodies get bloated, you know, you get worms, flies. It's not pleasant. They didn't want to bury it. It was fine. Everybody knew it was there. Because what happened is the survivors followed the carts to bury their people. They followed the carts to bury their people. Now, the government of the day, under Hotham, had arrested about 140 people, but decided to charge 13 with high treason. 13 men were charged with high treason. Now, high treason is a very specific term. Those of you who have heard me before, because the punishment for high treason, even in 1854, was hanging, drawing and quartering. What that means is because you were treason against the sovereign. That's why it's not just treason against the state, it's high treason. It's treason against the sovereign who's there by the will of God. Okay, that's the way it works. If you saw the coronation, you'll understand. So, not that I did, but there's high treason. So what that means is, right, first of all, you're strangled with a rope. You don't do a drop, you just hauled up until you're nearly dead, right? When you're nearly dead, you're laid out on a table. And there are thousands of people around you trying to get because these are public executions, because they are a warning to the population. This is what happens to you if you do this. Then the executioner gets a knife and splits you from stem to stern. Then the executioner will lift up your guts, your intestine, and they will be burnt. And the idea is not everybody can see the body on the table, but everybody can smell the burning intestines, which is something which will be with you for life. Then if the executioner felt merciful and he'd been paid a good bribe, he would rip out your heart. But if not, they would attach 4 horses to your arms and legs. This is where the quartering comes, and they'd pull your arms out and your legs out simultaneously. So that's the punishment. 1855, right? 13 men. The interesting thing is there were 2 black men, a man from Kingston, Jamaica, John Joseph from New York. There was a Jew, Mr. Sorensen from what is now modern-day Germany, but in those days was called, I've forgotten, but modern-day Germany. He was there. So there was a whole variety. There was only one native-born Australian amongst them, right? The rest were Irish rebels. You know, they just wanted to make a thing. But the thing is, in 1855, there was trial by jury in Victoria at the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court is now, trial by jury. And the authorities thought, well, why don't we try that man, John Joseph? He's the one who shot Captain Wise. He's black. There's no way a jury would acquit a black man, because before that, remember, there'd been a whole series of jury verdicts against Aborigines which led to their hangings, like Tunaminaway, Mulbohina, you know, right? And they said there's no way they would acquit him. Guess what? First trial, February 1855, he was acquitted. Acquitted. He was chaired through the streets of Melbourne. There are lino cuts of thousands of people cheering him through the streets of Melbourne. At the same time, there had been people placed amongst the thousands who had guns who were going to shoot up the Supreme Court if he hadn't been acquitted. Then they put up the Irish rebels. They were acquitted. Then they put up Raphael Comboni. He was acquitted. Even the Mr. Sorrison, the Jew, was acquitted. The other black man was acquitted. They're all acquitted. So the state had a problem. It had a population which was in revolt, open revolt. Didn't have enough troops. They didn't have helicopters and helicopter gunships and missiles and drones in those days. They needed troops on the ground to curtail a revolt. So what did they...
People had their own weapons.
And a lot of people had their own weapons. So what did they have to do? They had to acquiesce. They had to come to a compromise. And all the demands of the rebellion were accepted. The charter of the... accepted. And Mr. Humphrey, who was the leader of the pacifists in the Ballarat Reform League, and Mr. Layla, who was the leader of the direct actionists in the Ballarat Reform, were both elected to the Victorian Parliament by the end of the year. Raphael Comboni, who was the leader of the International Brigade, he was elected as a magistrate. He was appointed as a magistrate on the goldfields. So within 12 months there'd been this accommodation. But those of you who came to the lecture on the 1857 Land Convention will realise that our friends in the Legislative Council did everything they could to prevent universal male suffrage by introducing legislation that you needed £2,000 of land, which is equivalent to maybe $3 or $4 million today, before you could actually sit. You could actually sit for an election, and that you needed a 12 months gold licence in order to vote. So there are all these things which were put in their path, and we spoke about this later on. But so what are the lessons of the Ballarat Reform League? What are the lessons of the Eureka Rebellion? Why is it important in 1854? Why do we talk about it? Is it about democracy? No. Is it about miners' licence? No. It's about four basic principles which we have forgotten as a people. One is direct democracy. Democracy is not about electing representatives to make decisions for you when you know that real power doesn't lie in Parliament but lies in the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, who set the parliamentary agenda year after year after year, because parliamentarians will say to you, well, that's all we can do. We can't do any more. So Eureka Rebellion was about direct democracy, delegation against representation. Delegation is when a group of people come to a decision, elect or appoint a delegate to carry out that decision, and then ask that delegate to come back and report to them. And that's what the monster meetings were about. They made resolutions. Resolutions were given to the delegates went to Melbourne. They discussed issues with the colonial authorities who refused to compromise, which led to the Eureka Rebellion. Secondly, the other thing we've forgotten is how important solidarity is. We swear by the Southern Cross to stand truly by each other. Now, we live in a society where divide and rule is the key principle, where we're divided on the basis of race, gender, sexual orientation, colour of our skin, language spoken, cultural background, religion. It's in people's best interests to divide us. And what the Eureka Rebellions showed was it was a common enemy which forced people who wanted to, win that fight against the common enemy, to unite, irrespective of the colour of their skin, irrespective of the language they spoke, irrespective of their religious affiliation. So it was an international revolution, or rebellion. It wasn't a revolution, it was a rebellion. It was international, it was solidarity, it was direct action. And direct action was taking up arms to defend their rights and liberties against the state. Now, obviously, these periods of upheaval can be contained, and they were contained, because Victoria didn't break away like the United States of America from the British Empire. And the lessons were soon forgotten, because people they had to, there was no social security system, you had to earn a living some way. So the pressures of everyday living meant that the lessons of Eureka quickly evaporated. A year after the Eureka Rebellion, there was a gathering of about 250 people, to remember those who'd been killed. But as I said before, it's in the oath. We swear by the Southern Cross to stand truly by each other. Now today, unfortunately, in 2023, the Eureka flag and the symbolism, the story is forgotten. We see racists using the Eureka flag as their flag, forgetting that the Eureka struggle was an international struggle. It was a struggle carried out by everybody, different races. If you look at the historical record, it is there. It's never been a racist flag. Then we had the anti-vaxxers using the Eureka flag as some type of rebellion. If there's one group that knew about isolation and contagion, it was the Eureka rebels, because they came across on ships. People would die of typhoid, typhus. They would be tied up down there at Queenscliff. They'd be stuck in the quarantine station. People would die. Those that survived would be released. So they all knew, every single one of them knew and understood the importance of quarantine. They understood. So because somebody uses a symbol and takes it as their own, it doesn't mean that the reason they're using that symbol is correct. The other thing is that we've got to remember is that the Eureka Rebellion is contested history 169 years after it occurred. There are conservative and reactionary forces in this country who want us to forget the lessons of Eureka. And if they can actually downplay the significance, it works. For example, the Ballarat City Council, schizophrenics as far as Eureka is concerned. They would have loved to have buried it. They didn't want anything to do with it. Today they use the symbols of Eureka to big note themselves, their university, the city council, their stationery, their businesses. They use the symbols, they use the Southern Cross. But have once in the 168-year history of the Eureka Rebellion, even during the 150th anniversary celebration in 2004, have they flown the Eureka flag on the main flagpole on the Ballarat Town Hall? Never. And today they continue to resist that push. When my late wife and I went to Ballarat in 2001 to participate in the Eureka Rebellion, in 2001, when we went there in 2001, we said, "Oh, where's the celebrations?" They said, "What celebrations?" We said, "What? Eureka Day." And they said, "Oh, is it Eureka Day?" Then I said, "Oh yeah, they do something on Sunday." I said, "Fuck this." So we went home and we thought, "Fuck this. We're going to create the Reclaim the Radical Spirit of the Eureka Rebellion celebration group." And since 2002, despite widespread opposition from organisations in Ballarat who thought it was their little pet thing and we were going to destroy it, they fought tooth and nail. Now we are the ones that create the momentum to celebrate the Eureka Rebellion. And now we have teamed up with the Ballarat Trades Hall, which we've worked with for the last few years, to celebrate that thing. But if you go to Ballarat today, no Eureka flags anywhere. You can go to the Eureka Centre, pay your money, have a look at the flag. But most of the people in Ballarat don't know what the 3rd of December is, because there's no celebrations on the 3rd of December. There is no honour or respect shown for the men who are buried at Bakery Hill, at the old Ballarat Cemetery, and the other 25 that are buried all over the place. No respect whatsoever. When an organisation which was trying to resurrect the grave of Humphrey, who was a very important, member of the Ballarat Reform League, went up and down Humphrey Street in Ballarat, which was over a kilometre long, and asked businesses for a contribution to restore the grave. Only one business bothered to give them any money, and most of them didn't even know what they were talking about.
What year was that?
About 6 years ago. Yeah. So, and when you go to the old Ballarat Cemetery, the Eureka rebels' grave is in a state of disrepair. It is just disgusting, because they have forgotten their history. They're not interested, because it's about rebellion, it's about change, it's about radical change. So, I encourage you to come along on the 3rd of December. Great day, 4 a.m. start, dawn ceremony, beautifully cold, wonderful. After that, we have a communal breakfast. We don't cater. You bring your own food and drinks to share. After that, the toilets open at 6, so you've got to cross your legs. After that, we go to Bakery Hill to present Eureka Australia medals. Now, I'm sure you all know people who deserve a Eureka Australia medal. Nominations opened a few days ago. They'll close in the middle of November. We usually give out 6 on the day, and the medals are made by an engraver who's based in Cheltenham. Yeah. So we give out 6, so we've been doing that since 2005. After that, we'll go down to the old Ballarat Cemetery. We used to walk this. It was a 14-kilometre walk. I don't know if we'll do it anymore. But we'll go to the old Ballarat Cemetery to pay our respects to those who are buried there. And then from there, we go down to Ballarat Trades 4 for a late lunch and barbecue, which they put on. Then we go down to the Eureka Centre, where I give a presentation on the Eureka flag. And normally, we have a dinner, which has been cancelled the last few years because of COVID-19. So if you're coming, and I'll be advertising it heavily, I want people to pre-book for the dinner, because I want to be able to go to a restaurant and say, I've got 20 bookings, and know that people will turn up. Because last year, the Ballarat Trades Hall organised a late dinner, and they supposedly had 25 coming, only 10 came, which wasn't very nice. So, questions? Yes, Gaz?
Well, how much gold was in the treasury at that time?
I have no idea, but they had 30 Marines protecting the treasury, while 840 troops are up at Ballarat.
Collins Street.
No, Treasury Spring Street. You know Treasury,
Spring Street.
you know the Treasury building, which is now a bit of a museum just down the road. Why, you're thinking?
Someone missed a good opportunity.
It was an big opportunity. The state realised they'd made a mistake. They were all up there, suppressing the rebels.
So nobody got the gold treasure.
No, because there were 30 Marines outside with arms.
Pretty hard to get.
Yeah.
There was an event to do with a hotel that was burnt down near.
Yes, Bentley's Hotel. What started off, I forgot, well, I didn't mention it because what really got, you can have a discontent in a community, but what really got things going was not the fact there was a miner's licence, not the fact that the cops were brutal and they were brutalising the miners and getting money, from the fines, but the fact that a bloke called Scobie, James Scobie, was drinking at Bentley's Hotel, right? And he got into a fight with the owner, and he was beaten to a pulp and chucked out in the cold and died, right? There was a inquiry, a coroner's court or magistrate inquiry, which exonerated the owner of the hotel, right? And what happened is people were so incensed because the process was so corrupt that they went to the hotel and they burnt it down. And that was the catalyst for the formation of the Ballarat Reform League. the Bentley. But interestingly, this is fascinating. Life is fascinating. Now, Mr. Bentley claimed that he did not beat up Mr. Scobie, and he used to protest on the steps of Parliament House like us, right? And in I think it was 1872, 1873, he took cyanide as a protest and killed himself on the steps of Parliament House. Now, about 10 years ago, I got a call from one of the Bentleys' descendants, and I went to a little house in Frankston, and they still claimed that he had nothing to do with Scobie's death, and they were trying to sue the state government for millions of dollars. So it's interesting how then you've got the crazies, well, not crazies, but you've got people who think, but because they're descendants of Eureka rebels, irrespective of their political positions, that they own the thing, and they think of us as, you know, barbarians. But we're not interested in reenactments. We're interested in the spirit. We're interested in the radical spirit, the solidarity, the internationalism, the direct democracy, you know, the direct action. That's what we're interested in. We celebrate the spirit. It's not because it's a failed rebellion, because it was the spirit and how that came about and how people came together. And that's the dilemma we face in 2023. We don't come together because we've got a common enemy. For example, this is simple. Those of you who listen to the radio program, 70% of the reasons for increased inflation, increased interest rates are corporate profits. 70% of the, and I didn't make this up, this is their figures, 70%. Have any of the financial institutions had a drop in corporate profits? No. Have any of the big supermarkets had a drop? No, 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 no. And it's the ordinary person who's got to pay the cost for them. Although wages have gone up, they've gone up below inflation. So therefore, wages have actually gone backwards in the last 2 years. CEO wages on average went up 15% last year. 15%, that's the average. So what I'm saying is, and what they said is, it doesn't matter who's got their boot on your neck. It can be a woman, it can be a man, they can be black, they can be Christians, they can be Muslim. The problem isn't the fact that what they are, the problem is they've got your foot on your neck. And that's what we've forgotten, because we're too busy saying, look at that bloke, he wears a funny hat. And look at that one. She's got blue eyes and blonde hair, she's different. Green. So I won't talk about you guys. Carolyn, I wouldn't dare say anything about you. So it's a great audience.
Can I ask you, you're talking about Ballarat Reform League?
Yes.
4 principles. I've got 2 of them.
I think there were 5 principles.
Direct democracy,
No, well,
solidarity.
no. That wasn't the Ballarat Reform League. That's my interpretation of the Eureka. That's my interpretation of the Eureka Oath is solidarity,
Okay. Okay.
internationalism,
Yep.
direct action,
You've got that.
direct democracy.
Okay.
They're the 4 underlying principles. I mean, and I did a booklet on this, which is available on the net if you look for it. But if anybody's interested, I'll bring you a copy next month. But I'm just saying these are the 4 underlying principles, which if you can read as many Eureka books as you like, and there's thousands of them, about the personalities, about the events, but there's really nothing that actually looks at the historical, political essence of the rebellion.
Southern Hill?
That basically is a reenactment. It's a tourist reenactment. I'm not saying it's good, I'm not saying it's bad, but it's a reenactment. That's what Sovereign Hill is.
Why is the Ballarat Council so averse to
Because it's really, although there's a Green deputy mayor, I think, the thing is, it is a conservative, reactionary council. It's always been conservative. There was only
Victoria is a considered place.
there was only one good mayor, and she organised regular meetings with various groups that were conducting Eureka celebration events. And once she left, that was it. I mean, I was even asked about a decade ago to present a case for raising the flag, and they won't raise it unless it's an official Australian flag. Not that I've ever seen Torres Strait Islander flag or an Aboriginal flag flown on the main flagpole of the Ballarat. So it's an exceptionally conservative council. I'll give you an example of how disinterested people are in council elections. I think about 6 years ago, not this council, but the previous council, I organised a public meeting, right, in the Ballarat Trades Hall, right, of all the candidates. There were 17 candidates standing for positions, and I think 16 turned up. How many people do you think were in the audience? No, you're a bigger group. 3. It was so sad, and the Ballarat Trades Hall Council had been pushing it.
So what year?
So what happens is people with a conservative agenda get elected and re-elected and re-elected.
Yeah. Sounds a bit like there.
And I keep saying to the Ballarat Trades Hall, they should actually put up a ticket, a Ballarat Trades Hall ticket, not just a few of their members sitting, going, but put a real ticket up. But again, it's a small town. People have to live with each other.
Is that where George Pell came from?
I got no idea.
Where he ended up with the pedophile party.
Well, if you want to know about the pedophile priests, that's a different story. But the priest who ran, I've forgotten his name, but the priest who ran the school, the Catholic school, where all the pedophile priests were 150 years later, he was a great supporter of the Eureka Rebellion. He was the man who hid Laylaw and then got him onto a dray, and they took him to Geelong to treat his amputated arm. So he was a very positive influence. So there were a lot of positive influences in Ballarat at that time. But the thing is, there was only one person jailed because of the Ballarat Rebellion. And who do you think that was? No. I can talk to you about the Aborigines, I will in a minute. But it was Henry Seacombe, the editor of the Ballarat, I think it was the Ballarat Times it was called. He was seen as the pen of Eureka. Layla was the sword, he was the pen. And it was his constant action, printing up free posters, which they'd put up for the monster meetings, doing articles about breaking away. He saw the events leading up to the Eureka Rebellion as a nascent Republican movement. He was jailed for 3 months for treason.
All that sort of misinformation spreading to Melbourne and other places in Australia.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks, Joe. That's been uplifting.
Yeah, it is uplifting. It's a very uplifting story.
The third, I'll come.
Yeah, book in. Yeah.
It's been done before, yeah, it's been
Yeah,
done
I'm
before, so
booked
keep
in.
going.
Booked in,
Yeah,
you've got
yeah.
two coming.
Yeah. Now, I will talk about the Aboriginal component, because there is an Aboriginal component, because that's I think that's Tanarong and Watharong land. I could be wrong, but Tanarong definitely. The thing is that in Ballarat, Raphael Carboni was from Umbria, which was Italy hadn't been formed, in 1854. That was 1871, right? And he worked as a shepherd and lived with the local Aboriginal people in 1853 in Ballarat. When the camp was overrun, what happens? There are gunshots, there are people dying. The soldiers were bayoneting people in the encampment. So what happened is, women jumped over the stockade fence and laid their bodies across wounded, bleeding men to prevent them from being bayoneted by the soldiers. At the same time, what do you think happens? There are fires, there's gunshot, there's screaming. What happens to kids? They run. They run like the wind. They run away from all this. So they get dislocated from their parents. So what happened is the local Aboriginal groups that had survived collected the children and kept the children until they could be united with their parents in the next 24 to 36 hours. So there was this commonality in terms of oppression. Now, interestingly, Raphael Carboni, and we could do this here one day, Raphael Carboni wrote an opera called Gilbernia when he went back to Umbria, because he got sick of Australia, went back to Umbria, right? He wrote an opera called Gilbernia, which was lost until an Australian academic saw a copy about 20 years ago, an old copy in a book fair in Italy, right? And in this opera, which has been translated now into English, it's never been performed as an opera. When I win Tatslot, I'll get it organised. But he saw, and this is the first time in written history, he saw the Aboriginal population as victims of British colonialism. And that's what the opera was about, because of his experiences with the local Aboriginal people. You can find that called Gilbernia. Now, next month I'm going to do something. Next month I'm not doing the opera. I'm doing something interesting.
Come with a pint again?
Well, it depends if you're the only one here, Caroline. I think next month there'll be a bigger crowd, because next month I'm going to do something which has never been done before in the history of the human race. About 10 years ago, I wrote a play about Francesco Fantine called Q7461. Now, he was an Italian anarchist living in Australia who was killed while he was in internment camp as a fascist sympathiser, although he was an anarchist who was involved in activities against the fascists in 1943. And I've got this beautiful picture which we use. We go every year, Gaz has come, we go to Murchison Cemetery, the Italian cemetery, where they open up the vault. There's 225 people buried individually. They're all the Italians that died in the internment camps and in prisoner of war camps. They're all brought together in Murchison in the 50s by the Italian community, and they've all been buried there. And guess what? We found Francesco Fantine buried there, this anarchist. And I've done a play. So I'm going to do a reading. It's a one-act play. I'm going to do a reading next month. It'll be interesting. And there's a beautiful picture I got, and we've got a picture of him, and there are these there's two crosses and a triangle, right? Now, Fantine, well, he was anti-fascist, he was anarchist, he was atheist, and he was anti-militarist. They're his four principal components. So when he was buried, the Australian troops who were guarding paid him the respect of putting a triangle on his gravesite, not a cross, because he wasn't a Christian. And I've got this beautiful photograph, and we've got this huge banner with his picture, which I'll attach to here as a backdrop. But that's for the 19th of July. It'll be a reading. Any more questions about Eureka?
Oh,
You've been Eureka'd out.
yeah. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you for coming. It is the winter solstice. I'm glad. Let's thank.